My name is Eleanor Wilson. I'm 68. And on Mother's Day, my only daughter sent me a live snake in a box because I refused to give her my retirement money. That single cruel act forced me to make a choice: continue to be her victim or finally save myself. Now, she is permanently banned from my life and my will, and she will never touch a single dollar of my inheritance. It's a long story, but it's one I feel compelled to share. Perhaps there's someone out there feeling trapped as I once was, who needs to hear that it's possible to find peace. Before I dive in, I'd love to know where you're all joining me from. It's a comfort to know we're all connected in this moment. Please, take a second and let me know in the comments what country you're in and what time it is. It would mean the world to me. The humid, sweet air of my greenhouse has always been my refuge. For over 40 years, it has been my sanctuary, a place of quiet growth amidst the chaos of life. Here, surrounded by the earthy scent of damp soil and the delicate perfume of orchids, I could breathe. My husband, Robert, and I had built our life from scratch. He was the heart of our town's hardware store, a man known for his honest advice and calloused hands. I was the silent partner, the one who managed the books, turning his hard work into a stable future. We never chased extravagant wealth, but we achieved something far more precious: security. Our modest home, our carefully managed savings, and this little glass haven were the fruits of a lifetime of shared labor and quiet dedication. Each orchid that bloomed under my care was a testament to patience and nurturing, qualities I was beginning to realize I had squandered on the wrong garden. My phone buzzed on the potting bench, its vibration a jarring intrusion into my peaceful world. It rattled against a terracotta pot, demanding my attention. I wiped the rich soil from my fingers onto my worn apron, a familiar sense of weary resignation settling over me even before I saw the screen. It lit up with a photo of my daughter, Vanessa, on her wedding day 10 years ago. Her smile was wide and full of promise, her eyes bright with a future that seemed limitless. It was a day of profound hope, a day that now felt like a photograph from someone else's life. I took a deep breath and answered, forcing a warmth into my voice that my heart no longer possessed. "Hi, sweetie. Is everything okay?" "Mom!" "Oh, thank God you picked up. It's complete catastrophe, Mom, an absolute nightmare." I sighed, the sound lost in the quiet rustle of leaves as I picked up a small watering can. "What is it this time, Vanessa?" "It's the investment, Mom. The one Greg swore was a sure thing. It went belly up, Mom. We lost everything we put in. The rent is due this Friday, and Mr. Henderson is talking about eviction. Eviction, Mom! We'll be out on the street with the children." The investment. My mind reeled back through the litany of recent disasters. Last month, it was an unexpected root canal for Greg, an emergency that somehow coincided with a weekend trip to a wine festival they'd posted about on social media. The month before, it was a critical car repair for a vehicle I knew had just been serviced. For 3 long years, ever since Greg had been let go from his sales position, a polite term for being fired due to chronic underperformance, a fact I'd learned from a sympathetic former colleague of his, I had been the sole plumber for their perpetually leaking financial ship. It began subtly, a few $100s here for groceries, another 100 there for a utility bill, but the leaks had grown into gaping holes. Now the requests were in the thousands, each one accompanied by a more elaborate story and a more desperate plea. "Vanessa," I said, my voice gentle but laced with an exhaustion I couldn't hide, "we've had this conversation. You and Greg need to sit down and create a budget. Robert and I cannot continue to be your personal line of credit. It's not sustainable." "I know, Mom, I know. And we will. I swear in my life, we will." The same hollow promise, the same empty vow I'd heard a dozen times before. "But right now I'm terrified. Just think about Emma and Jake. They don't deserve this. Please, Mom, just this one last time. I promise it's the last time." The grandchildren. My 2 precious, innocent grandchildren. Emma, with her father's mischievous eyes and my own stubborn determination. Jake, my quiet, soulful boy who could spend hours with me in the greenhouse, his face a study in concentration as he watched me tend to the delicate blooms. They were her ultimate weapon, the emotional leverage she applied without hesitation, and it worked every single time. The thought of them facing any hardship, any uncertainty, was a physical pain, a sharp twisting in my gut. Just then, Robert entered the greenhouse, a silhouette against the bright afternoon sun. He held 2 mugs of coffee, a daily ritual of ours. He was a man of few words, but his perception was acute. He saw the tension in my shoulders, the weary grief on my face, and he knew instantly what this call was about. He set the mugs down on the bench, his gaze meeting mine with a clear, silent plea. "Don't do it, Elle." I turned away from his disappointed eyes, my back to the wall of glass that separated my sanctuary from the world. "How much, Vanessa?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She named the sum. It was a staggering amount, more than ever before. My stomach clenched violently. It would mean liquidating a significant portion of our savings, the very funds we had carefully earmarked for the Alaskan cruise we had been dreaming of for a decade. It was meant to be our reward, a celebration of a life of hard work. "I'll need to discuss this with your father," I said, the words feeling weak and evasive. "No, don't," she insisted, her voice suddenly sharp and commanding. "He'll just get angry and say no. You know how he is about money. Please, Mom, just do it. I'll pay you back, every single penny. My tax refund is coming soon. You know I'm good for it." But I knew she wasn't. The money always disappeared into a vortex of what she and Greg vaguely termed bad luck and unexpected expenses. I glanced over my shoulder at Robert. He was standing by the door, his posture rigid, his face a mask of stoic disappointment. He had worked his fingers to the bone, lifting heavy boxes and dealing with demanding customers for 40 years. All for us, all for our future, for a peaceful retirement. And I was standing here poised to give another piece of it away. He didn't say another word. He simply shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound sadness, and walked back into the house, leaving his full mug of coffee steaming and untouched. The silence on the other end of the phone was a heavy, expectant void. I felt cornered, suffocated by my own love for a daughter who used it as a tool, by my fierce devotion to my grandchildren, and by a crushing sense of maternal duty that was slowly, but surely, bleeding me dry. "Okay," I finally breathed, the single word tasting of failure and defeat. "I will transfer the money." The shift in her tone was immediate and jarring. "Oh, Mommy, thank you, thank you. You're a lifesaver. I love you so, so much," she chirped, the crisis miraculously averted. She hung up without another word. I stood frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear, staring at the vibrant, thriving orchids around me. I could give them the precise conditions, the exact amount of water and light, everything they needed to flourish. Why, then, was my every attempt to help my own child only causing her to wilt further, to become more dependent, more demanding? I walked back into the house, the rich aroma of coffee hanging in the air. Robert was sitting at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the old oak tree in our backyard. "I did it," I said softly, standing in the doorway. He didn't turn to look at me. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant branches. "I know," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You're watering a plant with rotten roots, Eleanor. One day, you're gonna have to accept that you can't save it. All you're doing is drowning yourself." At the time, I flinched at his words, thinking them too harsh, too unforgiving. I was still clinging to the hope that my love could fix her. I had no idea how prophetic his words would be, or that the rot was about to produce a venom that would poison us all. The week that followed the wire transfer was one of the longest of my life. A tense, brittle silence settled over our home, a quiet so profound it was almost louder than shouting. Robert was meticulously civil, but a chasm had opened between us. He'd ask if I wanted tea or if I'd seen the morning paper, but the easy warmth, the shared jokes, the comfortable companionship that had been the bedrock of our 40-year marriage had evaporated. It was replaced by a quiet, pervasive disappointment that clung to the air like a damp chill. I felt his pain, and I knew I was the cause of it. In the lonely quiet, I tried to justify my decision. It wasn't for Vanessa, I told myself repeatedly. It was for Emma and Jake. To fortify this conviction, I pulled out the heavy leather-bound photo album, its pages filled with the milestones of their young lives. I turned to the pictures from last Christmas, seeking reassurance in the captured moments of joy. There they were, bathed in the warm glow of the holiday lights. I had been teaching Jake my grandmother's recipe for gingerbread cookies, a tradition passed down through generations. The memory was so vivid, it was almost tangible. I could smell the sharp, sweet scent of ginger and cinnamon, feel the fine dust of flour on my hands. I remember the sensation of his small, chubby hands enclosed in mine as he carefully, painstakingly pressed a star-shaped cutter into the soft brown dough. His face was a mask of pure concentration. Emma, my little artist, sat at the other end of the table, meticulously decorating a gingerbread man with an elaborate suit of colored icing. Her pink tongue was stuck out from the corner of her mouth, a telltale sign of her intense focus. The kitchen had been a happy mess of flowers, sprinkles, and laughter. "Grandma," Jake had said, looking up at me, his eyes wide and impossibly serious, his face smudged with chocolate. "When I grow up, I'm going to open a bakery and sell your cookies. It'll be famous." I had laughed, a real full-bellied laugh, and pulled him into a tight hug, kissing the top of his flour-dusted head. "And I'd whispered into his hair, "will be your very first customer every single day." That love, that pure, unconditional, uncomplicated love, was the currency of my life, and Vanessa was spending it recklessly. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The wire transfer wasn't a loan or a gift. It was a ransom payment. It was the price of admission to my own grandchildren's lives, and the price was escalating with every demand. My somber reflection was shattered by the sound of a car engine, a car pulling into our driveway with far too much speed, the tires crunching loudly on the gravel path. I peered through the sheer curtains of the living room window, and my heart plummeted. It was Vanessa's beat-up, decade-old sedan, a trail of exhaust smoke in its wake. This wasn't a phone call. This was an ambush. Robert emerged from his workshop in the garage, wiping grease from his hands with a faded red rag. He saw the car through the open kitchen door, and his jaw tightened into a hard line. "What in God's name do they want now?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling slightly. But a cold, familiar dread was already coiling in the pit of my stomach. They didn't bother to knock. The front door swung open, and Vanessa strode in as if she owned the place, a habit that grated on my nerves every time. She wore an expression of strained, manic determination. Greg, a man whose posture always seemed to be a physical apology for his existence, shuffled in behind her, his gaze fixed on the floorboards, refusing to meet our eyes. "Mom, Dad," Vanessa announced, her voice a jarringly bright and false instrument, "we need to have a family meeting." "I think you've done enough talking for 1 week," Robert said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Vanessa, a master of selective hearing, ignored him completely. Her focus was a laser beam directed at me. "Mom, Dad, we've been doing a lot of thinking, Greg and I, and these small handouts, these little bailouts, they're not working. They're a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. We're always in crisis mode. What we need is a real long-term solution, a permanent one." I stood frozen, clutching the heavy photo album to my chest like a shield. "What are you talking about, Vanessa?" She took a deep, theatrical breath, puffing out her chest. The words that followed were so breathtakingly audacious, so steeped in a sense of entitlement that defied all logic, that for a moment I was certain I had slipped into some bizarre alternate reality. "We need access to your retirement fund," she stated, as calmly as she was asking for a cup of sugar. "Not all of it, of course," she added magnanimously. "Just a substantial portion, enough for a down payment on a decent house in a good school district, a real home for your grandchildren, and a little extra seed money to start a business. Greg has a brilliant idea for an online store specializing in vintage t-shirts." I stared at her, my mouth agape, the power of speech having abandoned me. The fund, our nest egg, the sum total of 40 years of scrimping and saving, of Robert working 60-hour weeks, of me poring over ledgers late into the night. Our security, our peace of mind, our one big dream of an Alaskan cruise. She spoke of it as if it were a community chest in a board game, there for her to dip into at will. Robert stepped forward, placing himself between me and our daughter. "Absolutely not," he said, and his voice was the sound of a heavy door slamming shut. "That is our money, Vanessa. We worked our entire lives for it. It is not and will never be a slush fund for your husband's half-baked get-rich-quick schemes." Greg flinched as if struck, but remained mute, a useless appendage to his wife's ambition. Vanessa's face hardened, the mask of civility dissolving to reveal the ugly snarl beneath. "It's my inheritance anyway," she shot back, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "You can't take it with you. Why are you hoarding it like some kind of dragon sitting on a pile of gold? We need it now. Your grandchildren deserve a better life." The sheer injustice of her words finally broke through my shock. "What your grandchildren deserve," I said, my voice shaking with a righteous fury I hadn't felt in years, "is for their parents to stand on their own 2 feet and act like responsible adults. The answer is no, Vanessa. It is not just no, it is never." That's when she snapped. Her eyes, wild and blazing with frustrated rage, darted around the room, searching for a weapon. They landed on the coffee table, on a beautiful ceramic mug I had bought on a trip to Sedona, its painted desert scene a memory of a happier, freer time. With a furious, guttural scream, she lunged, grabbed the mug, and hurled it with all her might against the stone fireplace. It exploded on impact, the sound of shattering ceramic as loud as a gunshot in the stunned silence. "Fine," she shrieked, her face twisted into a grotesque caricature of rage. "Be that way. Be selfish. But don't you dare come crying to me when you're old and alone. And don't even think about seeing Emma and Jake again. You hear me? If you won't help your family, then you don't get to be a part of it. You're done. We're done." She spun on her heel, grabbed a shell-shocked Greg by the arm, and stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard that the frame rattled and a picture of my own parents on the wall tilted askew. I stood trembling, my eyes fixed on the glittering, shattered remains of the mug on the hearth. It wasn't just a piece of pottery that had been broken in that moment. It was something deep inside me. The final, fragile, gossamer thread of hope that my daughter, the sweet little girl I had raised, loved, and sacrificed for, was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the layers of greed and resentment. Robert wrapped a strong arm around my shoulders. "I'm so sorry, Elle," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I just leaned into his solid warmth, the heavy photo album still pressed against my chest, and stared at the wreckage on the floor. In that moment of shattering clarity, I finally, truly understood what he had been trying to tell me. The rot was in the roots, and it was about to bear its most poisonous fruit yet. The days that followed the violent confrontation were a form of torture. The house, once our haven, felt like a tomb, heavy with a tense, grieving silence. Vanessa, true to her word, enacted her cruel embargo immediately. My daily video calls to the kids, a ritual that was the highlight of my day, went unanswered, ringing out into a digital void. My texts, filled with "I love you" and "thinking of you," were met with a cold, unyielding silence. I was excommunicated, and the quiet, where their laughter used to be, was a constant gnawing ache in the center of my chest. Robert tried his best to pull me from my despair. He'd bring me tea, suggest we work on a puzzle, or talk about the Alaskan cruise with a forced cheerfulness that broke my heart. "Look at this one, Elle," he'd say, pointing to a brochure showing a magnificent glacier. "We could be standing right there." But my heart was anchored in my grief, unable to imagine a future that didn't include my grandchildren's hugs. In a moment of weakness, I called my younger sister Carol, seeking the unique comfort only a sister can provide. But Carol, in her lifelong role as the family's designated peacemaker, only managed to pour salt in my wounds. "Oh, Eleanor, that sounds awful," she'd said with a dramatic sigh. "But you know how Vanessa gets. She has a temper, always has, even as a little girl. Maybe you were a bit too black and white with her. Refusing to help at all, that's pretty harsh. She is your only daughter, after all. Maybe you should just call her. Try to smooth things over." Her words, likely intended to be helpful, felt like tiny, sharp barbs of criticism. They planted seeds of doubt, making me question my own justified refusal, making me feel as though I was the one at fault for setting a boundary. Then came Sunday, Mother's Day. It dawned gray and overcast, the sky a perfect mirror of my mood. Robert, bless his heart, tried to make the day special. He made me my favorite blueberry pancakes from scratch and brought me the morning paper with a fresh cup of coffee. His quiet, steadfast presence was the only thing keeping me from dissolving completely into my sorrow. We were sitting in the living room, surrounded by a pile of newspapers we weren't reading, when the doorbell chimed. "I'll get that," Robert said, grateful for the interruption. He unfolded himself from his armchair and went to the door. I assumed it was a flower delivery from Carol, a gesture of placation after our tense phone call. But when Robert returned, he wasn't carrying a vase of flowers. He was holding a plain, brown, cardboard box, roughly the size of a shoebox, sealed with a sloppy, excessive amount of clear packing tape. "Who's it from?" I asked, my voice listless. "That's the strange part," he said, turning the box over in his large, capable hands. "There's no return address, just a prepaid shipping label. No name, no hint of who sent it." He peered at the printed label. "It's addressed to you, though." A tiny, foolish flicker of hope ignited in my chest, a testament to a mother's stubborn heart. Maybe it's from Vanessa," I whispered, the thought seeming both impossible and desperately needed. Robert didn't share my optimism. He was a practical man, a man who built things, who understood how the world worked. He noticed details others missed. He ran his hand along the side of the box, and his brow furrowed in concentration. "That's odd," he muttered, his voice dropping. "What is it, Robert? You're scaring me." He leaned in, my heart beginning to hammer against their ribs. He was right. A series of small, crude, almost desperate-looking holes had been pierced through the cardboard. It looked like something or someone had been struggling for air. "And listen," he whispered, his eyes wide as he held the box up to his ear. I held my breath, straining to hear over the frantic beating in my own ears. And then I heard it. It was faint, a dry, papery, shuffling sound. It was followed by a soft but unmistakable hiss. Sss. The last vestiges of my foolish hope of a Mother's Day reconciliation were instantly extinguished, replaced by a raw, primal fear. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the unthinkable. A sick prank? A direct threat? What could possibly be in that box? Robert placed the box with extreme care onto the center of our oak coffee table, handling it as if it were a live explosive. We both instinctively backed away, creating a wide circle around it. "What do we do?" I breathed, the words barely a whisper. Robert's face was grim, his decision already made. He was already pulling his phone from his pocket, his thumb moving swiftly across the screen. "We don't touch it. We don't open it. We don't go near it. We call 911. 911. The idea seemed so extreme, so melodramatic. This was our quiet suburban home, not the scene of a crime drama. But then I looked again at the box, at the sinister little holes promising a hidden horror within, and I heard that faint, chilling hiss in my memory. This wasn't a joke. This was a violation. This was an act of calculated terror delivered to my doorstep on the one day of the year meant to celebrate the sacred bond between a mother and her child.
While Robert spoke in a low, calm, and steady voice to the dispatcher on the other end of the line, I just stood there, paralyzed, staring at the brown box that had turned my living room into a place of fear. It was a Trojan horse, delivered by my own flesh and blood. At that moment, I didn't know what was inside, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the very marrow of my bones, that it was meant to break me. That box was a message, and for the first time in my life, I was truly ready to listen to what my daughter was telling me. The wait for the police was an exercise in suspended animation. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Every creak of the old house's foundation, every rustle of leaves outside the window, every passing car on our quiet street made me jump. My nerves stretched taut as piano wire. Robert and I stood by the front window, a silent vigil, our gazes repeatedly drawn back to the malevolent brown box sitting on our coffee table. It was a foreign object, a piece of shrapnel from a war I hadn't even realized I was fighting, and it had landed in the very heart of our home. Finally, a black and white patrol car pulled into our driveway, its movement slow and deliberate, its lights mercifully unlit. A tall, broad-shouldered officer with a serious face and a name tag that read Miller unfolded himself from the driver's seat. Robert met him at the door before he could even ring the bell, and I watched as he explained the situation in a low, urgent voice, gesturing back toward the living room. Officer Miller entered our home, his presence immediately filling the space. He was professional, calm, his eyes taking in everything at once. They swept the room and landed on the box. He gave a slow, thoughtful nod. "You absolutely did the right thing by calling," he said, his voice a calm baritone that cut through the thick tension in the room. He walked around the coffee table, keeping a respectful distance from the box. "And you're sure you have no idea who might have sent this package?" I exchanged a long, meaningful look with Robert. The unspoken name Vanessa hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. To say it aloud, to formally accuse my own daughter of such a malicious act to a uniformed police officer, felt like a monumental betrayal. It wasn't just an accusation, it was an amputation. It was the final, irrevocable severing of a bond that was already bleeding out. My voice was barely a whisper when I finally answered. "We might have an idea," I said, the words feeling like gravel in my throat. "We've been having some very difficult family trouble lately." Officer Miller just nodded again, his expression carefully neutral, unreadable. He was a professional. He'd seen the ugly underbelly of family disputes 100 times before. "Okay," he said, turning slightly and speaking into the radio clipped to his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I'm on scene at 124 Maple Drive. I'm going to need animal control to respond and take a look at a suspicious package." Animal control. The words, spoken so clinically into his radio, landed like a punch to my gut. They confirmed the dark reality of what we were facing. This wasn't just a package, it was a cage. We weren't dealing with an animate object, a simple prank. We were dealing with a living creature, deliberately weaponized and mailed to our home like a letter bomb. Another 20 minutes crawled by before the white animal control van, with its municipal seal on the side, pulled up behind the patrol car. A capable-looking woman in a khaki uniform, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, came to the door. Her name tag read Santos. She carried a pair of thick leather gauntlets and a long metal pole with a retractable loop at the end. Her demeanor was no nonsense. "Okay, folks," Officer Miller said, directing us with a gesture. "Ma'am, sir, for your safety, why don't you wait in the kitchen while we see what we've got here?" We retreated, as instructed, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I stood in the kitchen doorway, my hand clutching Robert's arm, and watched the surreal scene unfold in my own living room. Santos approached the box with the practiced caution of someone who had dealt with the unpredictable many times. She didn't tear it open. She used a small, sharp utility knife to carefully, surgically slit the layers of packing tape. She peeled it back slowly, methodically. Then she lifted one cardboard flap just an inch, peered inside, and immediately let it fall shut. She looked over at Officer Miller, her face grim, and gave a single sharp nod. "Yep," she said, her voice clear and carrying into the kitchen. "It's a snake." A snake. My daughter had sent me a snake for Mother's Day. The monstrous reality of it was so profound, so beyond any human decency I understood, that my mind struggled to fully process it. Santos worked with a cool efficiency that I found both terrifying and admirable. She opened the box fully, and with a swift, fluid motion, used her pole to deftly loop the creature inside. She lifted it out. It was about 3 feet long, its body a vibrant, beautiful pattern of orange, red, and black. It writhed and twisted on the end of the pole, its forked tongue flicking in and out, tasting the air of my home, a place it never should have been. "It's a corn snake," Santos explained, her voice remaining calm as she expertly lowered the frantic animal into a secure plastic carrier she had brought in with her. "They are non-venomous, very popular in the pet trade. But," she added, looking directly at me with sympathetic eyes, "I imagine it would give you quite a shock if you weren't expecting to find one in your mail."
A shock. The word was so inadequate, so sanitized. This wasn't about being shocked. This was about being terrorized. This was a psychological attack designed to inflict maximum emotional distress. Officer Miller walked into the kitchen where we stood, frozen and mute. His professional demeanor had softened, and his eyes held a look of genuine concern. "Mrs. Wilson," he said gently, "what happened here today is not just a cruel prank. Mailing live vertebrates through the Postal Service like this is a federal offense. This is a serious crime. I need to ask you again, and I need you to be honest with me. Who do you think sent this package?" The moment of truth had arrived, stark and unavoidable. There was no more room for excuses, no more hiding behind maternal instinct, no more protecting the person who had just declared war on me. The years of kindness, of sacrifice, of turning the other cheek had been repaid with this act of calculated malice. To protect her now would be to become an active participant in my own abuse. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the air rattling in my lungs. I looked past the officer's concerned face to the empty, violated box on my coffee table, now a piece of evidence in a criminal investigation. My voice, when I finally found it, was as clear and steady as a church bell on a calm morning. "I know exactly who sent it," I said. "It was my daughter, Vanessa." Once the police and the animal control officer had gone, taking the snake and the box with them, an unnatural silence descended upon the house. It was a vacuum, an absence of sound that felt heavier and more oppressive than the earlier tension. The empty spot on the coffee table seemed to pulse with a dark, residual energy, a stain of the violation that had occurred there. The air itself felt tainted. Robert, ever my rock, moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, as if his steady actions could restore normalcy to our upended world. He went into the kitchen and made us some tea, the familiar ritual, a small anchor in a sea of chaos. We sat at the kitchen table, the untouched cups steaming between us, the silence stretching on. "What do you do now, Elle?" he finally asked, his voice low and gravelly with erosion. His eyes, usually so full of life and humor, were shadowed with a pain that mirrored my own. For my entire adult life as a mother, my answer to any crisis involving Vanessa had been the same: smooth things over, forgive, forget, rebuild the bridge no matter how badly she had damaged it. My core instinct was to absorb the hurt, to shoulder the blame if necessary, all in the service of fixing the relationship. But as I looked at Robert's weary, careworn face, I saw with blinding clarity the true cost of my fixing. My endless well of patience had not healed my daughter. It had only enabled her, allowed her to fester, to become the cruel, entitled person who could conceive of such an act. My help had been her poison. "I don't know," I answered, the honesty of the words a small liberation. "But I know what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to call her. I'm not going to scream or cry, and I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen." As I spoke, a thought, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced through the fog of my shock and grief. How? How had she done it?
A snake isn't a bouquet of flowers. You can't just order one from a catalog. It had to be purchased. And purchasing things costs money. Money that I knew for a fact Vanessa and Greg, with their chronic unemployment and endless emergencies, did not have. Unless... The blood in my veins turned to ice. A sudden, sickening certainty took hold of me. I pushed my chair back from the table so abruptly that its legs scraped against the floor. I stood up and walked, zombie-like, to the small office off the living room where we kept our family computer. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" Robert asked, his voice filled with concern as he followed me into the room. "I just have a feeling. A horrible, horrible feeling." I sat down at the old, cluttered desk and turned on the desktop computer. It whirred to life with a slow, groaning sound, the process feeling agonizingly slow. My fingers, usually so nimble on a keyboard from my years of bookkeeping, felt clumsy and stiff. I fumbled with the password, mistyping it twice, before the familiar desktop finally appeared. I navigated to our credit card's website, my heart pounding, a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. Years ago, in a moment of what I now saw as profound, misguided generosity, I had added Vanessa as an authorized user on one of my main credit cards. The original intention was that it would be for true emergencies only, a flat tire, a sick child needing a doctor. It was supposed to be a safety net. But over time, that safety net had become her personal expense account. I'd seen the small, questionable charges appear with increasing frequency. Gasoline for a car that rarely left their driveway, expensive groceries from high-end stores, a steady stream of online purchases from clothing boutiques. I had always let them slide, choosing to pay the bill and avoid the inevitable confrontation. The price of peace, I had told myself. But it wasn't peace. It was a slow, steady erosion of my boundaries and my salary. I logged into the account, my breath held tight in my chest, a prayer on my lips that I would be proven wrong. I began to scroll through the list of recent transactions, my eyes scanning the familiar litany of our lives. Robert's purchases at the hardware supply store, my trips to the pharmacy, the weekly bill from the grocery store. I kept scrolling, back through the previous weeks. And then I saw it. My breath caught in my throat with a painful gasp. I felt my husband's hand land on my shoulder, his grip tightening as he too stared at the screen. The charge was dated 3 weeks prior. The merchant name was listed as Reptile Palace, LLC. The amount was $150. 3 weeks. This wasn't a spontaneous act of fury after our fight last week. This wasn't an impulsive decision made in the heat of anger. This was premeditated. This was a calculated plot. While I was lying awake at night, sick with worry about her financial stability, she was calmly browse a website for live reptiles. While I was depleting our savings to pay her rent, she was plotting this act of psychological warfare. She had used my own money, the very instrument of my unending support, to purchase the weapon she would ultimately aim directly at my heart. The sheer, diabolical treachery of it was a physical blow. It knocked the wind out of me. This transcended a cruel prank or a nasty fight. This was a profound and intimate betrayal. This was theft. This was fraud. This was a daughter using her mother's love, trust, and financial support as a tool for a sick, twisted, and deeply personal act of revenge. But in that dark moment of revelation, something inside me shifted on a tectonic level. The shock, the hurt, the grief, they began to compress, to heat up, to crystallize into something new, something hard and clear and diamond sharp. It was rage. A pure, righteous, cleansing rage that burned away the fog of misplaced maternal guilt and years of self-doubt.
My mind flashed through a montage of sacrifice, the vacations we'd postponed, the home repairs we'd put off, the constant low-grade anxiety that had become the background noise of my life, the strain it had put on my marriage, the silent disapproval in Robert's eyes. I had poured so much of my life, my resources, and my love into a bottomless pit, convinced that one day it would be enough. And this was my return on that investment. A snake in a box, bought and paid for by me. She used my card, Robert, I whispered, the words like shards of glass in my mouth. She used my own money to do this to me. He squeezed my shoulder, his grip firm and grounding, a silent transfer of his own strength to me. Then it's over, Eleanor, he said, his voice quiet but absolute, devoid of any doubt. It's all over now. I stared at the damning transaction on the screen, the digital proof of her utter depravity, and I knew with every fiber of my being that he was right. This was the end. There would be no more chances, no more excuses, no more looking the other way. The bridge between my daughter and me wasn't just burned, it had been methodically, deliberately, and irrevocably blown to pieces, and I had no intention of ever trying to rebuild it again. The anger that had ignited in my small, cluttered office didn't flare up and burn out. It settled deep within me, a low, steady pilot light of resolve. It was a foreign feeling, this cold fury. For years, my emotional landscape had been dominated by worry, by guilt, by a pervasive sense of maternal responsibility. This new anger was clean. It was clarifying. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't sad, or scared, or confused. I was certain. But certainty required one final piece of confirmation. I needed to extinguish any last, lingering, microscopic ember of doubt. My mind, conditioned by years of making excuses for her, might later try to whisper possibilities. Maybe Greg did it without her knowledge. Maybe her account was hacked. I needed to hear it from her own lips, to close the door on this chapter of my life with my own hand. Robert saw the grim determination on my face as I picked up my cell phone from the kitchen counter. "Elle, are you sure?" he asked, his voice gentle, laced with concern. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to talk to her. You don't owe her a single thing, least of all a conversation." "I know," I said, my thumb hovering over her contact photo, that same smiling bride from a decade ago. It seemed like a cruel joke now. "This isn't for her, Robert. This is for me." I pressed the call button and immediately activated the speakerphone, placing the small device in the center of the kitchen table. It felt like we were in a war room, planning a final offensive. Robert stood beside me, his hand resting on the back of my chair, a silent, grounding presence. The phone rang. Once, twice, a third time. My heart hammered against my ribs. I almost thought she wouldn't answer, that she would hide and cowardly silent. Then the line clicked and the connection was made. "Hello?" Vanessa's voice was cautious, wary, the voice of someone testing the temperature of the water. I kept my own voice perfectly level, a calm, flat surface on a turbulent sea of emotion. "Hello, Vanessa. It's your mother." "Mom?" she said, and I could hear the immediate jarring shift into her manipulative little girl lost persona. "Oh, Mom, I was so worried. I've been calling and texting. You haven't been answering." The sheer unmitigated gall of it, the breathtaking audacity almost made me laugh out loud. "I've been busy, Vanessa," I said, my voice as cool and smooth as polished stone. "I had an unexpected visit from the police this morning." There was a sharp, audible intake of breath on her end of the line. It was followed by a silence so profound, so telling, that it was practically a confession in itself. "The police," she finally managed to say, her voice laced with a transparently fake concern. "Why? Is everything okay? Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine now," I said, letting the silence stretch for a beat before delivering the next blow. "They were here to deal with the special Mother's Day gift you sent me, the one you purchased from Reptile Palace." Silence. Again, longer this time. I could almost hear the frantic gears turning in her head as she scrambled to construct a plausible lie, a way to spin this outrageous situation to her advantage.
I I honestly don't know what you're talking about, Mom. I didn't send you anything. Why would I do that? Really? That's peculiar. Because there was a charge on my credit card, the one you're an authorized user on, to that exact store. It seems you bought me a 3-foot corn snake 3 weeks ago. An interesting purchase for someone who claims to be on the brink of eviction. That's insane. That's crazy. Someone must have stolen your card information. Oh my God, Mom, you have to cancel it immediately. I can't believe someone would do that. That's so scary. She was laying it on thick, piling layers of feigned outrage and concern on top of her lie. And she might have continued, might have spun an even more elaborate tale of being the victim of identity theft. But then I heard it. It started faintly, a low, rumbling sound in the background of her call, almost like static. But it wasn't static. It was a man's chuckle. It was Greg. And as Vanessa continued her frantic, transparent performance, the chuckle grew louder, bolder, blossoming into a full-throated, unrestrained, mocking laugh. It was a laugh filled with utter contempt and derision. It was the laugh of a schoolyard bully who had just pulled off a cruel prank on the teacher's pet. It was the laugh of someone who thought they had gotten away with it, who was reveling in the chaos and pain they had caused. That sound, that horrible, cruel sound, cut through me more effectively than any confession could have. It was the irrefragable truth delivered in a wave of pure, unadulterated malice. They weren't sorry, they weren't scared, they were proud. They were sitting there, together, laughing at me, laughing at my pain. Vanessa must have realized I'd heard him, so she suddenly started talking over the sound, her words tumbling out in a rush. Greg, be quiet. Shut up. Mom, that's not... He's just watching a funny video on his phone. It has nothing to do with this, I swear. I held up my hand, a gesture she couldn't see, but Robert could. I'd heard enough. I didn't need any more lies, any more pathetic attempts at manipulation. I had my answer. Robert's face had transformed into a mask of cold, quiet fury. He'd heard it too. Thank you, Vanessa, I said, and my voice was so cold, so devoid of any warmth, it surprised even me.
I looked at Robert. The hurt in his eyes had been completely vanquished, replaced by the same steely resolve that now fortified my own heart. The final question had been answered. There was no misunderstanding, there was no room for doubt. This was a deliberate, coordinated act of psychological warfare from my daughter and her parasitic husband. The sound of his laughter would echo in the chambers of my memory for days to come. But it would not haunt me. It would not break me. It was the catalyst I never knew I needed. It was the sound of my old life, the life of a willing victim, of a mother who loved too much and too foolishly, crashing and burning to the ground. And from the ashes, something new, something much stronger, was beginning to rise. The hours that followed that final, chilling phone call were not spent in grief or despair. They were a blur of cool, focused activity. The shock had burned away, leaving behind a hard, crystalline clarity. The path forward, which had been obscured by a fog of maternal obligation for years, was now starkly, brutally clear. Robert and I moved around the house like a well-oiled machine, our grief transmuted into a shared grim purpose. This was no longer just a messy family drama. This was a matter of our own safety and security. My own daughter, my only child, had proven herself to be a tangible threat. First things first, Robert said, his voice a low, determined command. He stood in the doorway of my office, pointing toward the phone. The credit card. You need to call the bank. Not tomorrow, not in an hour, right now. And you tell them to remove her name from that account permanently. I was already dialing, the number familiar from years of paying the bills she had racked up. I navigated the automated phone tree with a newfound impatience, finally reaching a live human being.
I explained the situation calmly and concisely. I reported the card as compromised, explained that an unauthorized user had made fraudulent purchases, and instructed them in no uncertain terms to revoke Vanessa's access and remove her name from my account forever. The customer service representative, a young woman who sounded impossibly cheerful, was polite and efficient. Within 10 minutes, the financial lifeline that Vanessa had treated as an entitlement, the one she had abused for years, was severed. It was the first decisive snip of the scissors. It felt surprisingly, profoundly good. It felt like reclaiming a piece of my stolen sovereignty. But I knew this was just the first step on a long, arduous road. The snake, the theft from my credit card, the threat to withhold my grandchildren, the demand for my retirement savings. This constellation of betrayals went far beyond a simple family squabble. This required a level of strategic protection that I, a woman who had spent her life tending to orchids and balancing ledgers, did not know how to achieve on my own. "I need a lawyer," I said to Robert as I hung up the phone. The word felt foreign in my mouth. His brow furrowed, his expression serious. "A lawyer? Elle, what are you thinking? Are you planning on pressing charges for the snake?" "I'm thinking about everything," I said, my mind racing through a terrifying landscape of possibilities. The will, the house, the inheritance she is so convinced she's entitled to. What if she tries to have me declared incompetent to get control of my assets? What about custody issues if she tries to use the kids as leverage? I feel like I'm walking through a minefield in the dark, and I have no idea where the mines are buried. The thought of finding a lawyer was, in itself, overwhelming. I pictured a cold, impersonal office in a sterile downtown high-rise, a slick professional in an expensive suit charging by the minute to listen to the sordid, messy details of my family's implosion. A wave of exhaustion and despair washed over me. It all felt like too much. I sat down heavily at my desk, my head in my hands. I needed someone I could trust, someone who would see me not as a billing hour, but a human being. Someone who would fight for me. My mind, grasping for a lifeline, drifted back through time. To my own mother, Catherine. She had been a force of nature, a woman of immense strength and practicality. After my father passed away, she had navigated the labyrinth of legal and financial affairs with a confidence I had always admired. And I remembered now that she hadn't done it alone. A name, a memory from the past surfaced in my mind. A woman my mother had spoken of with a unique blend of respect and affection. I stood up, a new energy coursing through me, and went to the old oak filing cabinet in the corner, a repository of decades of family records. I pulled open the top drawer, its runners squeaking in protest, and found my mother's old address book. The leather was soft and cracked with age, the pages yellowed and filled with the elegant, looping script of her handwriting. I flipped through the familiar names of old friends and distant relatives until I found the S section. And there it was, written in confident blue ink. Summers, Margaret, attorney at law. The memory of her came flooding back. A sharp, witty, intelligent woman who had been a few years behind my mother in school. They had lost touch for decades, but had reconnected later in life at a charity luncheon. Margaret had been the one who helped my mother set up her will and a trust for me. My mother had always called her a total spitfire. It was a long shot. The address book was at least 15 years old. Margaret could be retired or have moved. But it was a thread of hope, and I had to pull on it. I looked up the firm, Summers and Associates, online and felt a surge of relief to see it was still in business at the same downtown address. I dialed the number, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and nervous anxiety. A crisp, professional voice answered. "Summers and Associates, how may I direct your call?" "I'd like to speak with Margaret Summers, please." "May I ask who is calling?" My name is Eleanor Wilson. My mother was Catherine Gable. I'm not sure if she'll remember me or my mother, but I was put on hold, the sound of bland classical music filling the silence. I fully expected to be told she was unavailable or to be passed off to a junior associate. But after only a moment, a new voice came on the line. It was clear, crisp, and radiated an unmistakable authority. This is Margaret Summers. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling slightly. Miss Summers, my name is Eleanor Wilson. My mother, Catherine Gable, spoke very highly of you. I find myself in a very difficult situation, and I was hoping I might be able to get some legal advice. There was a pause, and then, Catherine's daughter, Margaret said, her voice softening with a note of recognition. Of course, I remember your mother very well. A wonderful, wonderful woman. She was tough as nails. Tell me, Eleanor, what kind of trouble are you in?
And so the floodgates opened. I told her everything. I started with the years of mounting financial drain, the endless litany of fabricated emergencies. My voice was steady as I relayed the facts. Then I told her about the demand for our retirement fund, the ugly confrontation, and the shattered mug. My voice began to tremble. Finally, my voice cracking with emotion, I told her about the box, the hissing, and the snake. When I finished, the line was silent for a long, heavy moment. I worried I had shocked her into silence, that my problems were too ugly, too strange, too personal. But when Margaret spoke again, her professional crispness was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective fire that warmed me through the phone. Eleanor, she said, her voice like steel, your mother was one of the toughest women I ever had the privilege of knowing, and you are her daughter. What your child has done is not just cruel, it's predatory. This isn't a family tiff that can be solved with a group hug. This is an attack. And as of this moment, we are going to fight back. Hard. Tears pricked my eyes, but for the first time in weeks, they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. I wasn't alone in this anymore. I had found my Spitfire. When can you come in? Margaret asked, her voice all business again. We have a fortress to build. 2 days later, Robert and I found ourselves sitting in the quiet, sun-drenched conference room of Margaret Summers' office. It wasn't the cold, intimidating glass and steel box I'd pictured in my mind. It was a comfortable, dignified space, the walls lined with shelves groaning under the weight of thick legal books. A large window looked out over a leafy downtown street, giving the room a sense of calm solidity. Margaret herself was exactly as I remembered her from years ago. Petite and impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, her silver hair cut in a sharp, modern style. Her eyes, magnified slightly by her glasses, were bright, intelligent, and missed nothing. She sat opposite us at a large mahogany table, a yellow legal pad already filled with her neat, precise handwriting in front of her. All right, Eleanor Robert, she began, her tone professional but not unkind. Let's lay out our strategy. As I see it, our mission here is twofold. First, and most urgently, we need to protect you and your assets from any further harm. Second, we need to secure the future for your grandchildren, Emma and Jake, ensuring they are shielded from the fallout of their parents' destructive behavior. The mention of their names sent a familiar ache through my heart, but it also solidified my resolve. Everything I was about to do, I was doing for them as much as for myself, as much as for me. I've already contacted the credit card company, I confirmed, my voice stronger than I expected it to be. Vanessa's name has been permanently removed from the account. I have also got online and changed all the passwords for our bank accounts and investment portfolios. Excellent, Margaret said, making a sharp, decisive note on her pad. That's the first wall in your new fortress. You've cut off the immediate supply line. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture, your estate, your will.
She looked at me directly, her gaze unwavering. As it currently stands, I assume Vanessa is the primary beneficiary of your estate and the designated executor. I nodded numbly, the word beneficiary tasting like ashes in my mouth. The irony was suffocating. We need to change that immediately, Margaret stated, her voice leaving no room for argument. My team and I will draft a new will today. It will explicitly disinherit her. We will be very clear and direct about the reasons, not in a vindictive way, but in a factual one. This is crucial to preempt any attempt she might make down the road to contest it on the grounds of your competency or of undue influence. Robert, who had been listening in stoic silence, shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. I could see the profound conflict warring in his face. This was so final, so absolute. "Is there no other way, Margaret?" he asked, his voice strained with pain. "To cut her out completely? My God, she's still our daughter." Margaret's expression softened with a flicker of genuine empathy, but her voice remained firm as granite. "Robert, I understand that this is an incredibly painful and unnatural step for a parent to take, but you have to see Vanessa for who she is now, not the little girl you remember bouncing on your knee. This is a woman who, in response to being denied access to your retirement funds, sent a live snake to your home on Mother's Day. I ask you to consider this. Do you believe she would act as a responsible steward of your life's legacy? Or would she and her husband squander it in a matter of years, leaving nothing for Emma and Jake?" His shoulders slumped in defeat. He knew she was right. Every word she spoke was the hard, unvarnished truth. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for confirmation, for strength. I gave him a small, determined nod. He reached across the polished table and took my hand, his familiar, calloused grip a source of immense comfort. "Do what needs to be done," he said to Margaret, his voice heavy with resignation. Margaret nodded, her gaze already moving to the next point on her list. "The next step is the most important one. We're not just taking away from Vanessa, we're giving to the children. We will establish an irrevocable trust, which we can call the Wilson Grandchildren's Trust. It's a legal shield. You will fund it with a portion of your estate. As the creator of the trust, you can set the terms. I would advise that I, as a neutral third party, be named the trustee. The terms will be explicit and ironclad. The funds can only be used for the health, education, and general welfare of Emma and Jake. Vanessa and Greg will have zero access or control over this money, not a single dime." An educational trust. The idea was a beacon of pure light in the suffocating darkness of the past few weeks. It was a way to transform my pain into a promise. It meant that no matter how deep their parents' irresponsibility ran, my grandchildren's future, their college fund, their chance at a life of their own making would be safe and secure. My love for them could finally be channeled into something truly productive and protective, not enabling and destructive. Finally, Margaret said, her expression turning even more serious, "We need to discuss a restraining order." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. A legal decree to keep my own daughter away from my home, from me? It felt like the most unnatural, heartbreaking concept in the world. "Is that really necessary?" I asked, my voice small, almost a whisper. "Eleanor," she said, leaning forward slightly, "she threatened you. She has a demonstrated volatile temper, as evidenced by the shattered mug. Then she escalated to sending a live animal to your home on Mother's Day. That is a clear, documented pattern of harassment and intimidation. A restraining order does two things. First, it sends an unambiguous legal message. The boundary is here. Do not cross it. And second, more practically, it gives you immediate recourse to call the police if she shows up at your home again, and they will be obligated to remove her. It is for your physical safety and your peace of mind."
The rest of the afternoon was a marathon of legal paperwork. Margaret and her paralegal worked with astonishing speed and efficiency, drafting the complex documents that would fundamentally restructure our lives. By late afternoon, a formidable stack of papers sat on the conference table in front of us. The new last will and testament, the irrevocable trust agreement, the petition for the restraining order. Margaret slid the first document toward me, a heavy, cream-colored paper, and placed a sleek black fountain pen beside it. It was the will. My eye scanned the dense legal jargon until I found the clause, the one that felt like it had been written in blood. The words seemed to leap off the page. I intentionally make no provision in this will for my daughter Vanessa Wilson, nor for her issue, except as is otherwise provided for in the aforementioned Wilson Grandchildren's Trust. I picked up the pen. It felt as heavy as a lead weight in my trembling hand. The signature was so much more than ink on paper. It was the formal, legal codification of the end of a relationship. It was a mother's final, heartbreaking admission that her child was lost to her. A single, hot tear escaped my eye and rolled down my cheek, splashing onto the page right next to the signature line. Robert squeezed my hand, his grip a silent message of support. "It's okay, my love," he whispered. "You're doing the right thing, the only thing we can do." With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like it was being torn from the depths of my soul, I signed my name. And with that single, shaky signature, I signed away the daughter I had once known and loved, and began the fight for the peaceful future I knew I deserved. In the days that followed our marathon session at Margaret's office, a profound and unexpected shift occurred within me. The grief, which had been a constant, suffocating fog, was still there, a dull ache beneath the surface like a phantom limb, but it was now overlaid with a new, unfamiliar sense of purpose. Margaret had called my actions building a fortress. The metaphor resonated deep within me, becoming my mantra. Each phone call I made, each form I filled out, each difficult decision I enacted was another heavy stone laid in the wall that would protect Robert and me from the chaos. The first calls were the most emotionally taxing. I had to contact our life insurance company, a policy we had taken out 30 years ago. I was connected to a cheerful young man named Kevin who followed his customer service script with relentless pleasantry. "Okay, Mrs. Wilson," he chirped after I provided my policy number. "So you'd like to change the primary beneficiary on your policy, and who will the new beneficiary be?" "The Wilson Grandchildren's Trust," I said, the words feeling sterile and cold. I gave him the legal details Margaret had provided. "No problem at all. And the reason for this change today, ma'am, if I don't mind me asking for our records?" I took a breath. "My daughter," I said, my voice flat and even, "is no longer my beneficiary." There was a slight, almost imperceptible pause on the other end of the line. "Oh, okay. One moment, please." I imagined Kevin, in his cubicle somewhere across the country, had never had that particular box to check on his form before. The conversation was a small death, a formal severing of a tie that had once been a sacred promise. Next on the list was the bank. I had to speak to a branch manager, a woman named Miss Albright, whom I'd known for years. I explained that I needed to put a permanent block on any and all transfer requests originating from Vanessa's old account numbers, just in case she tried to socially engineer her way back into our finances. Miss Albright was the soul of discretion. "Of course, Eleanor," she said, her voice full of quiet sympathy. "Consider it done. I'm so sorry you're having to go through this." Her kindness was a small balm on a very raw wound. With each action, the walls of my fortress grew higher, thicker. I was no longer a passive victim of my daughter's whims, no longer a ship tossed about on the waves of her constant crises. I was the architect of my own safety, the general of my own small army. The feeling was intoxicatingly empowering. Robert saw the transformation in me. The weary slump in my shoulders was gone, replaced with a straight-backed resolve. The haunted, grief-stricken look in my eyes had been supplanted by a clear, focused light. He started calling me the General, a term of endearment that made me smile for the first time in weeks.
Did the general make her strategic calls today? He'd ask with a small teasing smile when he came in from the garage, smelling of sawdust and oil. The northern wall is now fully secured, I'd reply, playing along with our new gallows humor. Tomorrow, we fortify the eastern flank by contacting the pension administrator. The lightheartedness was our survival mechanism. It was our way of coping, of turning this ugly, painful, and deeply unnatural process into a shared mission. We were a team again, a true partnership, united against a common threat. The chasm of disappointment that had opened between us after I'd given Vanessa that last sum of money had vanished, filled in by a renewed and profound sense of mutual respect and love. One afternoon, as I was sorting through a pile of financial statements, my sister Carol called. Her voice when I answered was syrupy, with a concern that I now recognized as a precursor to meddling. "Eleanor, honey, I heard the most awful, unbelievable rumor," she said, her voice a dramatic whisper. "Brenda from my book club said her cousin who lives down your street saw a police car at your house on Mother's Day. She said you called the police on poor Vanessa." I leaned back in my chair, my patience, which had once been a vast, deep ocean, now as shallow as a puddle. "It's not a rumor, Carol," I said, my voice cool and even. "It's a fact. I called the police because Vanessa sent me a snake in a box." "A snake?" she gasped. "Oh, Eleanor, you know Vanessa has always had a strange theatrical sense of humor. It was probably just a silly, misguided prank. You can't cut your own daughter off for a prank." The familiar excuses, the gentle invalidation of my feelings, no longer had any power over me. "Was it also a prank when she used my credit card without my permission to buy it, Carol?" I countered, my voice sharp. "Or when she screamed at me and demanded my retirement savings? Or when she threatened that I would never see my grandchildren again? Tell me, where does a prank end and harassment begin?" Carol was silent, sputtering on the other end of the line. I continued, my voice as cold as ice. "I've years you've told me I should be less harsh, that I should just smooth things over. You made me feel guilty for wanting to set a simple boundary. I know you think you're being a peacemaker, but you're not. You're an enabler, Carol. You've been just as much of an enabler as I was."
I heard a sharp intake of breath. "Well, I never," she began, her voice full of wounded pride. "It's okay, Carol," I said, cutting her off, though it wasn't okay at all. I just didn't have the energy for that particular battle. "I have to go. I have things to do." I hung up the phone before she could reply. I had just added another heavy stone to the wall. This one was harder to place because it meant creating a necessary distance, not just from my destructive daughter, but from a sister who, in her own well-meaning but misguided way, had been complicit in the dynamic that had almost destroyed me. The final piece of the fortress arrived a few days later. It was a plain white business envelope from the county court. Inside, printed on official watermarked paper, was the signed temporary restraining order against Vanessa Wilson and Gregory Miller. It detailed in cold, legal language the boundaries they were now forbidden to cross: our home, our street, Robert's hardware store. Any contact, in person, by phone, by email, through a third party, was now a violation of a court order. I held the document in my hands. It was just a few sheets of paper, but they held so much power and represented so much pain. This was the moat. This was the locked gate and the raised drawbridge. "It's done," I said to Robert, my voice thick with emotion as I held it up for him to see. He came over and wrapped his strong arms around me. I leaned my head against his chest, the crisp legal paper crinkling between us. "The fortress is built, Elle," he said softly into my hair. "Yes," I whispered back, closing my eyes. "It is." Now all we could do was wait. Wait to see if the enemy we had created, the enemy we had once called family, would dare to try and storm the castle.
For 2 full weeks, an unnerving, almost unnatural peace settled over our lives. The phone remained silent, no longer a harbinger of manufactured crises. No angry cars tore into our driveway. It was the deep, resonant quiet I had craved for years, yet it felt fragile, like the calm in the eye of a hurricane. It was the quiet of an army gathering its forces just over the hill, planning its next assault. I tried, with a conscious effort, to embrace the tranquility. I forced myself to believe it could last. I spent long, meditative hours in my greenhouse, the familiar, methodical work of repotting orchids soothing my frayed nerves. Robert and I resurrected our dream of the Alaskan cruise, spreading glossy brochures across the dining room table, their images of majestic glaciers and serene fjords, a promise of a different kind of life. We were beginning to allow ourselves to imagine a future free from the constant, draining drama, a future that was finally, truly our own. The illusion of that future was shattered on a bright, sunny Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, standing at the sink, washing crisp leaves of romaine lettuce for a salad. The sunlight streamed through the window, glinting off the water. It was a perfectly ordinary, peaceful moment. And then I heard the car. It wasn't the sound of a neighbor's gentle arrival or a delivery truck's slow approach. This was the sound of fury. The engine roared with aggression, and the tires spat a shower of gravel as the vehicle skidded to a halt in our driveway. My heart leapt into my throat, a wild, panicked bird beating against my ribs. I didn't need to look. I knew who it was. Robert came running in from the backyard, his face pale, his eyes wide with alarm. "They're here," he said, his voice a low, grim statement of fact. Before we could even speak another word, before we could react or prepare, our front door burst open with such force that it slammed against the interior wall, leaving a mark. We never locked our doors in the middle of the day. We lived in a quiet, safe neighborhood. In all our 40 years in this house, we had never needed to. Until now. Vanessa stormed into our home, her face a grotesque mask of purple rage. Her hair was a mess, her eyes wild and bloodshot. Greg trailed in her wake, a pathetic and frightened shadow, his expression a cowardly mixture of fear and resentment. "What have you done?" she shrieked, her voice a piercing, ugly sound that echoed through our quiet home, violating its peace. She was waving a piece of paper in her fist, shaking it violently. I recognized the distinctive blue and white design of a credit card statement. My card was declined! Declined! I was trying to buy groceries, and the cashier told me my card was rejected in front of a line of people. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? I turned from the sink and slowly, deliberately, dried my hands on a dish towel. My heart was pounding, but it was a different kind of pounding than before. It wasn't the frantic beat of fear. It was the steady, determined drumbeat of a soldier facing a battle she knew was coming, a battle she was prepared to fight. That card is no longer active, Vanessa," I said, my voice remarkably calm and even. "I canceled it 2 weeks ago." She sputtered and eyes widened in genuine, uncomprehending disbelief. It was clear from her expression that the thought that I would ever actually follow through on a threat, that I would ever truly cut her off, had never seriously entered her mind. She had always believed I was too weak, too much of a mother to do it. "And all of your access to my bank accounts has been permanently revoked," I continued, taking a single, deliberate step forward. Robert moved instantly to stand beside me, a silent, solid presence at my shoulder. "The automatic payments have been stopped. The monthly allowance is over. The financial support has ended." Greg, her silent, useless husband, finally found his voice, a whining, reedy sound. "You can't do that! You just can't! We have bills to pay! What are we supposed to do now?" "That," Robert said, his voice as hard and cold as iron, is something the two of you should have thought about a long time ago. It's called getting a job, Greg. I suggest you look into it." Vanessa ignored her husband and her father, her furious gaze locked solely on me, the architect of her inconvenience. Her face contorted, and for a terrifying second, she looked exactly as she had in the moments before she'd thrown the mug. "This is all about the money, isn't it?" she snarled. "You're cutting me off from my own inheritance. You selfish, hoarding old woman. You'd rather sit on a pile of money and watch it grow than help your own family, your own flesh and blood." The word inheritance hung in the air, ripe and rotten. It was the key that unlocked her entire worldview. She saw us not as their parents, the people who had raised them and loved them, but as the stubborn, inconvenient custodians of their future fortune. It was time, once and for all, to disabuse her of that poisonous notion. This was the moment. The fortress was under siege. The confrontation I had both dreaded and meticulously preparing for was finally here. This was the final battle for my own life.
The accusation, raw and venomous, hung in the air between us like a foul odor. Selfish, hoarding old woman. The words were crafted to be weapons, designed to pierce the armor of my resolve and strike at the soft, vulnerable heart of maternal guilt she had so expertly manipulated for decades. A year ago, a month ago, even 2 weeks ago, they would have found their mark. They would have wounded me, made me doubt myself, made me question if I was, in fact, the monster she was painting me to be. But not today. Today, they were just noise. The meaningless, desperate shrieks of a tyrant who had just lost her kingdom. I took another, calm, deliberate step forward, closing the distance until we were only a few feet apart. I wanted her to see my face clearly. I wanted her to see that the woman she thought she knew, the soft-hearted, easily swayed mother, was gone, replaced by someone she did not recognize at all. "You are mistaken about two fundamental things, Vanessa," I said, my voice quiet but resonating with the weight of absolute, unshakable authority. "First, it is not your inheritance. It is my money and your father's money. We worked for it. Every single penny. We sacrificed for it. You did not. You have no claim to it. Second, and more importantly, your name is no longer in our will." The color drained from her face, leaving it a pasty, mottled gray. Even in the depths of her rage, this was a possibility she had not allowed herself to consider. "You're lying," she whispered, the words catching in her throat, strangled by disbelief. "I am not lying," I stated, my gaze as steady as a rock. "We met with our lawyer, Margaret Summers, 2 weeks ago. We signed a new, legally binding last will and testament. You have been formally, explicitly, and completely disinherited." "You can't!" she shrieked, the denial giving way to raw, animal panic. "That's not legal. I'll fight it. I'll get my own lawyer. I'll take you to court. I'll tell the judge you're senile, that you're not competent to make your own decisions." Her threats, once so terrifying, now seemed pathetic. That's when I saw Robert move. He walked with a calm, unhurried gait over to the small mahogany table by the door where we kept the mail, and he picked up a large manila envelope. He held it out toward Vanessa. "Margaret anticipated you might say something like that," Robert said, his voice flat. "She prepared a summary of the new estate plan for you. I suggest you read it." Vanessa snatched the envelope from his hand with a jerky, angry motion and tore it open. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of fury and fear, scanned the pages. I could see the moment the truth began to sink in. I saw her read the legal name of the new trust, the Wilson Grandchildren's Trust. I saw her eyes catch on the clause stating that the funds were to be managed by a neutral third-party trustee. I saw her read the ironclad line specifying that the money was to be used exclusively for the health, education, and welfare of Emma Rose Wilson and Jacob Robert Miller, and that she, Vanessa Wilson, and her husband, Gregory Miller, were explicitly and permanently barred from ever accessing or controlling said funds. It was all there, in cold, hard, legally binding print. The fortress I had so carefully constructed was impenetrable. Her assault had failed. She looked up from the papers, her face a maelstrom of shock, fury, and dawning abject horror. This was real. The bank of Mom and Dad, the bank she had believed held an infinite line of credit, was closed. Permanently. And then, cornered and defeated, she did the only thing she had left to do. She reached for her ultimate weapon, the one she had always saved for last. She fell back on emotional blackmail. "Fine," she screamed, her voice cracking, dissolving into a hysterical, tear-filled sob. She crumpled the legal papers in her fist, crushing them into a useless ball. "You want to play hardball? You want to be cruel? Fine. We'll see who's cruel. You will never see Emma and Jape again. I mean it this time. This isn't a threat, it's a promise. I will get sole custody in the divorce I'm sure Greg is about to have to get a job for. I will move to another state, and I will tell them that their grandmother is a horrible, vindictive monster who threw their mother out on the street. They will grow up hating you. Is that what you want? To die old and alone, hated by your own grandchildren?" This was it. The final, desperate nuclear option aimed directly at the most vulnerable part of my heart. The choice she was forcing on me was monstrous. My financial security and peace of mind versus my grandchildren's love. My throat tightened, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, my resolve wavered. The image of Jake's trusting, serious face, of Emma's gap-toothed, joyful grin flashed in my mind. The pain of losing them was a physical force, a giant hand squeezing my heart, threatening to buckle my knees and bring me to the floor in surrender. I looked at Robert. He was watching me, his own face etched with a profound pain, but his eyes were steady. They held a silent message that I understood completely. "Stay strong, Elle. We knew this was the price. Don't let her win." I took a deep, shuddering breath and met my daughter's wild, tear-filled eyes. In their depths, buried under years of resentment and selfishness, I could still see the ghost of the little girl I had loved so fiercely. And it was because of that lingering love, and because I loved her children more than I feared her threats, that I knew what I had to do. "I am not losing my grandchildren, Vanessa," I said, and my voice was the steadiest it had been all day, clear and ringing with a conviction that came from the very core of my being. "I am protecting them. I am protecting their future from your recklessness, your instability, and your cruelty." I turned, walked with measured steps to the desk in the office, and picked up the last document. The final stone in the wall, the ultimate defense. I walked back and held it out for her to see, the official seal of the court clearly visible. "And I am protecting myself," I said, my voice dropping, low and final. "This is a temporary restraining order, signed by a judge of the Superior Court. It legally forbids you and Greg from coming within 500 feet of this house, my husband, or me. You are in violation of that order at this very moment. You have exactly 1 minute to leave my property before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ragged, choking gasp that escaped Vanessa's lips. She stared at the court order, then at my face. Her eyes were searching for the mother she used to know, the woman who would fold, who would cry, who would do anything to avoid a confrontation, who would always, always give in. But that woman was gone.
She had died on Mother's Day, in a living room that smelled of fear and betrayal. In her place stood a stranger, a woman with a spine of steel and a fortress around her heart. Defeated, utterly and completely, she finally broke. A choked animal sob escaped her. She dropped the crumpled papers to the floor, turned without another word, and stumbled out of the house. Greg, his face ashen, scurried behind her like a frightened shadow.
We listened as their car door slammed, the engine roaring to life before the tires squealed out of our driveway, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a profound, echoing silence. The battle was over. I had won. But standing there in my quiet, sunlit living room, all I could feel was the immense, breathtaking, and heartbreaking cost of that victory. In the weeks that followed the final, ugly confrontation, our house slowly began to feel like a home again. The silence Vanessa left in her wake was no longer fragile or tense. It was deep, peaceful, and profoundly restorative. It was the encompassing quiet that follows a violent, feverish storm, when the air is washed clean and you can finally breathe again. The war was over. There were aftershocks, of course, the ground settling after the earthquake. A few days after the incident, I received a long, rambling, tearful voicemail from Vanessa. It was a bizarre cocktail of accusations, self-pity, and half-hearted apologies. I listened to the first 30 seconds, felt the old familiar pull of manipulation, and calmly pressed the delete button. I did not listen to the rest. A week later, my sister Carol called, her tone having done a complete 180. She had apparently spoken to a neighbor who had witnessed the end of the confrontation. "I can't believe she spoke to you that way, Eleanor," she'd said, full of righteous indignation on my behalf now that the tide had turned. "You did the right thing." I accepted her apology, but a small, sad distance had been created between us. I knew our relationship would never be quite the same. The lines of loyalty had been redrawn, and some things, once broken, can never be perfectly mended. The legal process, unlike our family ties, moved forward with a cool efficiency. The temporary restraining order was made permanent by a judge after Vanessa and Greg failed to appear in court to contest it. Margaret handled everything, a fierce and efficient guardian of our newfound peace. She was more than a lawyer. She had become a friend, a trusted ally in the fight for my own life. Slowly, day by day, Robert and I began to reclaim our lives. We talked more than we had in years, not about problems or crises, but about small things. The book I was reading, a project he was working on in the garage, a funny story in the newspaper. We rediscovered the easy, comfortable companionship that had been the foundation of our marriage, a foundation that had been eroded by the constant stress of dealing with Vanessa. One evening, we sat down at the computer together and, with a few clicks, officially booked our Alaskan cruise for the following summer. It was a simple act, but it felt like a monumental declaration of independence. The most significant ache, the one that lingered in the quiet moments, was the absence of the grandchildren. It was a constant, low-grade pain in my heart. But Margaret, in her wisdom, had facilitated a solution. As part of the legal arrangement, she acted as an intermediary. Once a week, a package would arrive at her law office, which her assistant would then forward to us. Inside would be crayon drawings from Emma, her artistic flair already evident, and short, block-lettered notes from Jake about school or his favorite cartoons. My heart broke and soared with each delivery. I missed their hugs, their laughter, the sweet smell of their hair after a bath. But seeing their drawings
knowing their college education and their future were secure, was a profound comfort. I was loving them from a distance, but it was a truer, healthier, more protective love than the one that I had been forced to demonstrate before. One bright Saturday morning, about 3 months after that horrible day, I was in my greenhouse, my sanctuary. The air was warm and filled with the scent of life. I was tending to a particularly stubborn orchid, a beautiful white phalaenopsis that I'd had for years, but which had refused to bloom since Vanessa's troubles began. I had almost given up on it, thinking it had gone dormant for good. But as I misted its broad green leaves, my eyes caught something I hadn't seen before. Tucked beneath a leaf, almost hidden, was a slender green shoot, pale and new, reaching for the light. And at its very tip was a small, tightly closed bud, a perfect pearlescent promise. It was going to bloom. I reached out and touched the bud gently with the tip of my finger. All the patience, the care, the careful watering and feeding, it hadn't been in vain. Life, I was reminded, finds a way. Just then, Robert came into the greenhouse holding a familiar manila envelope. It was from Margaret's office. I opened it carefully. Inside was a school photo of Emma and Jake. Emma was missing her 2 front teeth and grinning a wide, goofy, utterly joyful grin. Jake looked so serious and handsome in a little collared shirt, his hair neatly combed. They were beautiful. They were happy. They were thriving. I looked from the photograph of my beautiful grandchildren to the promising, perfect bud on the orchid. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt a sense of pure, uncomplicated, profound joy. The storm was over. The fortress had held. The cost had been immeasurably high, paid for in tears and heartbreak, but the peace it had purchased was priceless. My life had been pruned back, cut down to its essential roots. It was smaller in some ways now, quieter, but it was also stronger, healthier. I finally learned that love isn't about endless, unconditional giving, especially when that giving becomes a form of self-destruction. True love is about knowing where to draw the line. It's about understanding that a parent's greatest promotion in life is not to CEO of their child's unending happiness, but to the fierce guardian of their own hard-won peace. Boundaries, I now know, are not the walls that keep love out. They are the strong, deep foundations that allow a healthy, beautiful life to be built. I still think of Vanessa, the daughter I lost to a darkness I may never understand. I pray she finds her way out of it. But her journey is no longer my responsibility. My responsibility now is to the good man who stood by me through the fire, to the innocent grandchildren whose future I have secured, and finally, to myself. I am tending my own garden now. And finally, after a long, hard winter, things are starting to bloom again.